Hey everybody, this is part 2 of a book or pamphlet by Julius Martov that's titled The State and the Socialist Revolution. Part 2 is an essay titled Decomposition or Conquest of State Power. It's from 1919. The very partisans of the, quote, pure Soviet system, end quote, parenthesis, an expression current in Germany, end parenthesis, do not themselves realize, as a rule, that the cause which is fundamentally served by the methods of contemporary Bolshevism is the organization of a minority dictatorship. On the contrary, they usually begin by looking around sincerely for political instruments that might best express the genuine will of the majority. They arrive at, quote, Sovietism, end quote, only after repudiating the instrument of universal suffrage because it does not seem to furnish the solution they are seeking. Psychologically, the most characteristic thing about the rush of the, quote, extreme leftists, end quote, toward, quote, Sovietism, end quote, is their desire to jump over the historic inertia of the masses. Dominating their logic, however, is the idea that Soviets constitute a new, quote, finally discovered, end quote, political mode. This, they say, is the specific instrument of the class rule of the proletariat, just as the democratic republic is, according to them, the specific instrument of the rule of the bourgeoisie. The idea that the working class can only come to power by using social forms that are absolutely different, even in principle, from those assumed by the power of the bourgeoisie, has existed since the dawn of the revolutionary labor movement. We find it, for example, in the fearless propaganda of the immediate predecessors of the Chartist movement, the construction worker James Morrison and his friend the weaver James Smith. Not seeing anything for yeah, I'm not finding anything. I don't know if these names are right. At the time when the advanced workers of the period were only beginning to conceive the idea that there was the need of seizing political power and to win universal suffrage in order to accomplish the latter, Smith was already writing this journal, The Crisis, April 12, 1834, quote, ... We shall have a real House of Commons. We have never yet had a House of Commons. The only House of Commons is a House of Trades, and that is only beginning to be formed. We shall have a new set of boroughs when the unions are organized. Every trade shall be a borough, and every trade shall have a council of representatives to conduct its affairs. Our present commoners know nothing of the interests of the people, and care not for them, ... The character of the reformed parliament is now blasted, and like a character of a woman, when lost, is not easily recovered. It will be replaced with a house of trades, end quote. Morrison wrote in his publication, The Pioneer, May 31st, 1834, quote, The growing power and growing intelligence of the trade unions, when properly managed, will draw into its vortex all the commercial interests of the country, and in doing so, it will become, by its own self-acquired importance, a most influential, we might almost say dictatorial part of the body politic. When this happens, we have gained all that we want. We have gained universal suffrage, for if every member of the union be a constituent, and the union itself becoming a vital member of the state, it instantly erects itself into a House of Trades, which must supply the place of the present House of Commons, and direct industrial affairs of the country, according to the will of the trades that compose the associations of industry, ... With us, universal suffrage will begin in our lodges, extend to the general union, embrace the management of trade, and finally swallow up the political power, end quote. It's from Morrison, writing in the publication The Pioneer, 31st of May, 1834. Substitute Soviet for Union, Executive Committee, parenthesis, quote, ISPOLCOM, according to Wikipedia, the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, commonly known as the Petrograd Soviet ISPOLCOM, was a self-appointed executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet. As an antagonist to the Russian Provisional Government after the 1917 February Revolution in Russia, the ISPOLCOM became a second center of power. ISPOLCOM was dissolved during the Bolshevik October Revolution later that year. The ISPOLCOM are known for the controversial, quote, Order Number 1, end quote, parenthesis, N3, end parenthesis, which stipulated that all military units should form committees like the Petrograd Soviet, and that the military from every political perspective should not contradict the ISPOLCOM. The Socialists of the Petrograd Soviet feared that officers were the most likely counter-revolutionary elements, and the intention of the order was to limit their power. These orders rendered the officers powerless at the Russian front lines of World War II, which led to confusion, disastrous military discipline, and desertions. Back to the text. Substitute Soviet for Union Executive Committee, parenthesis, quote, ISPOLCOM, end quote, end parenthesis, for Council of Representatives, Soviet Congress for House of Trades, and you have a draft of the, quote, Soviet system, end quote, established on the basis of productive cells. In his polemic against the trade union conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, B. O'Brien, who later headed the Chartists, wrote, quote, universal suffrage does not signify meddling with politics, but the rule of the people in the state and municipality, a government therefore in favor of the working man, end quote. B. O'Brien. Wikipedia says, I typed in O'Brien, and it says James Bronterre O'Brien lived from 1804 to 1864. James Bronterre O'Brien was an Irish Chartist leader, reformer, and journalist. Back to the text. Basing itself largely on the experience of the revolutionary labor movement in England, the 1848 communism, scientific socialism of Marx and Engels identified the problem of the conquest of state power by the proletariat with that of the organization of a rational democracy. The Communist Manifesto declared, quote, we have already seen that the first step in the working class revolution is raising the proletariat to the position of a ruling class, the conquest of democracy, end quote. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. According to Lenin, the manifesto poses the question of the state, quote, still extremely in the abstract and employing ideas and expressions that are quite general, end quote. Parentheses, State and Revolution, page 29, Russian edition, end parentheses. The problem of the conquest of state power is presented more concretely in the 18th Brumaire. Its concretization is completed in civil war in France, written after the experience of the Paris Commune. Lenin is of the opinion that in the course of this development, Marx has been led precisely to that conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which forms today the basis of Bolshevism. In 1852, in 18th Brumaire, Marx wrote, quote, every previous revolution has brought the machinery of state to a greater perfection instead of breaking it up, end quote. On the 12th of April, 1871, in a letter to Kugelmann, Marx formulated his viewpoint on the problem of revolution as follows, quote, if you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will see that I declare the next attempt of the French Revolution to be not merely to hand over from one set to another the bureaucratic and military machine as was the case up to now, but to shatter it. That is precisely the preliminary condition of any real people's revolution on the continent. It is exactly this that constitutes the attempt of our heroic Parisian comrades," end quote. Marx. In this spirit, Marx declared, in Civil War in France, that the Commune was, quote, "a republic that was not merely to suppress the monarchic form of class domination, but the class state itself," end quote. What was then the Commune? It was an attempt to bring about the effective and rational establishment of a democratic state by destroying the military and bureaucratic state apparatus. The Commune was an attempt to establish a state based entirely on the power of the people. As long as Marx speaks of the destruction of the bureaucracy, the police and permanent army, as long as Marx speaks of the electiveness and recall of all officials, of the broadest autonomy possible in local administration, of the centralization of all power in the hands of the people's representatives, thus doing away with the gap between the legislative and executive departments of the government, and replacing the, quote, talking, end quote, parliament with a, quote, working institution, end quote, end parenthesis. As long as Marx speaks of all this in Marx's defense of the Commune, Marx remains faithful to the conception of the social revolution Marx presented in the Communist Manifesto, in which the dictatorship of the proletariat is identified with the, quote, conquest of democracy, end quote. Marx therefore remains quite logical with himself when in his letter to Kugelmann, quoted above, Marx stresses that the, quote, destruction of the bureaucratic and military machine, end quote, is the, quote, preliminary condition of any real people's revolution on the continent, end quote. Marx therefore remains quite logical with himself. Sorry, there's italics in this. Marx remains quite logical with himself when in his letter to Kugelmann, quoted above, Marx stresses that the, quote, destruction of the bureaucratic and military machine, end quote, is the, quote, preliminary condition of any real people's revolution on the continent, end quote, parenthesis, R emphasis, end parenthesis. On this point, it is interesting to compare the experience gathered by Marx and Engels from the events of 1848 with the conclusions drawn by Alexander Herzen. In his Letters from France and Italy, Herzen wrote, quote, "When universal suffrage is found alongside the monarchic organization of the state, when universal suffrage is found alongside that absurd separation of power so glorified by the partisans of constitutional forms, when universal suffrage is found alongside a religious conception of representation, alongside a police centralization of the entire state in the hands of a cabinet, then universal suffrage is an optical illusion and has about as much value as the equality preached by Christianity. It is not enough to assemble once a year, elect a deputy, and then return home to resume the passive role of administered subjects. The entire social hierarchy should be based on universal suffrage. The local community should elect its government and the department, parenthesis, province, and parenthesis, its own. All pro-councils made sacred by the mystery of ministerial unction ought to be done away with. Only then will the people be able to exercise effectively all their rights and proceed intelligently with the election of their representatives to a central parliament," end quote. Herzen. The bourgeois Republicans, quite on the contrary, quote, wanted to maintain the cities and municipalities in complete dependence on the executive power and applied the democratic idea of universal suffrage to only one civic act, end quote. Herzen, Works. Pavlenkov, edited, Volume 5, pages 122 to 123. Sorry, I'm looking for to see if there's anything of Herzen's letters from France and Italy, and I found a blurb out for the book. I don't know if it'll tell us anything. Herzen is one of the most important early Russian revolutionaries. Herzen became a representative figure in both Russian both Russia and the West as an irrepressible enemy and victim of Tsarist oppression. Alexander Herzen's activity as a publisher and a journalist provided a voice for the Russian opposition, and Alexander Herzen made major theoretical contributions to the development of Russian socialist ideology. When he traveled to Western Europe, he was never to return to Russia. Herzen became an eyewitness to the 1848 revolution in France and the rather operatic early episodes of revolution in the states of the Italian peninsula. Alexander Herzen's description of events in Paris ranks with the works of Marx and Tocqueville as a classic account of the revolution. Herzen's letters written for publication are also a literary treat with a brilliant display of wit and sensibility. The text is rich in wordplay in 2 or 3 languages, hyperbole, irony, and other literary devices. Moreover, each of Herzen's moods has its stylistic reflections. The light-hearted traveler, the angry moralist, the enraged revolutionary bystander, each using language differently but effectively. Back to the text. In other words, Herzen, like Marx, denounced the pseudo-democratic bourgeois republic in the name of a republic that was genuinely democratic. And like Herzen, Marx rose against universal suffrage to the extent that universal suffrage is no more than a deceptive appendix attached to the, quote, monarchic organization of the state, end quote, a legacy of the past. He opposed it because he was for a state organization built from top to bottom on universal suffrage and the sovereignty of the people. Commenting on Marx's idea, Lenin observes, parentheses, State and Revolution, page 367, end parentheses, quote, this could be conceived in 1871 when England was still the pattern of a purely capitalist country without a military machine and in a large measure without a bureaucracy. That is why Marx excluded England, where a revolution, even a people's revolution, could be imagined, and was then possible without the preliminary condition of the destruction of the state machine, since the latter was available already for it, end quote. Lenin, State and Revolution. Unfortunately, Lenin hurries to pass over this point without reflecting on all the questions posed for us by Marx's restrictions. According to Lenin, Marx admitted a situation in which the People's Revolution would not need to shatter the already available ready state machinery. This is the case when the state machinery did not have the military and bureaucratic character typical of the continent and could therefore be utilized by a real People's Revolution. The existence within the framework of capitalism, and in spite of the latter, of a democratic apparatus of self-administration, which the military and bureaucratic machine had not succeeded in crushing, was evidently exceptional. In that case, according to Marx, the People's Revolution should simply take possession of that apparatus and perfect it, thus realizing the state form that the revolution could best use for its creative purposes. It is not for nothing that Marx and Engels admitted theoretically the possibility of a Pacific socialist revolution in England. This theoretic possibility rested precisely on the democratic character capable of being perfected which the British state presented in their day. Much water has flowed under the bridges since then. In England, as in the United States, imperialism has forged the, quote, military and bureaucratic state machine, end quote, the absence of which had constituted as a general feature the difference between the political evolution of the Anglo-Saxon countries and the general type of capitalist state. At the present time, it is permissible to doubt if this feature has been preserved even in the youngest Anglo-Saxon republics, Australia and New Zealand. Quote, today, end quote, remarks Lenin with justification, quote, both in England and in America, the, quote, preliminary condition of any real people's revolution, end quote, is the break-up, the shattering of the, quote, available ready machinery of the state, end quote, Lenin. Footnote. It is as if Martov, writing in Russia immediately after the World War, actually thought that by 1919 all democratic state machinery developed up to then in England, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and other points west had been replaced with military bureaucratic institutions. Something as similar is taking place as an uncontradictable fact by the well-read and right-thinking Soviet citizen of 1938. In Martov's case, the error is not accounted for altogether by the post-war blockade of Russia. We have already noted that no more than his compatriot Lenin did Martov, also a product of the Russian revolutionary movement, see clearly the relation between capitalism and popular, quote, democratic, end quote, political mass support. Yet how much insight into what is really the same problem is shown by him in the immediately preceding metaphysical materialism and dialectical materialism, which I guess is a piece. It might have been a section from the last part of this book. I can't remember. The theoretic possibility has not revealed itself in reality, but the sole fact that he admitted such a possibility shows us clearly Marx's opinion, leaving no room for arbitrary interpretations. What Marx designated as the, quote, destruction of the state machine, end quote, in the 18th Brumaire, and in Marx's letter to Kugelmann, was the destruction of the military and bureaucratic apparatus. What Marx designated as the, quote, destruction of the state machine in 18th Brumaire and in his letter to Kugelmann was the destruction of the military and bureaucratic apparatus that the bourgeois democracy had inherited from the monarchy and perfected in the process of consolidating the rule of the bourgeois class. There's nothing in Marx's reasoning that even suggests the destruction of the state organization as such. There is nothing in Marx's reasoning that even suggests the destruction of the state organization as such, and the replacement of the state during the revolutionary period, that is, during the dictatorship of the proletariat, with a social bond formed on a principle opposed to that of the state. With a social bond formed on a principle opposed to that of the state. Marx and Engels foresaw such a substitution only at the end of a process of, quote, a progressive withering away, end quote, of the state, and all the functions of social coercion. Marx and Engels foresaw this atrophy of the state and the function of social coercion to be the result of the prolonged existence of the socialist regime. It is not for any idle reason that Engels wrote in 1891 in his preface to Civil War in France, quote, in reality, the state is nothing more than a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed in the democratic republic no less than in the monarchy, and at best an evil inherited by the proletariat after the proletariat's victorious struggle for class supremacy, whose worst sides the proletariat, just like the commune, will have at the earliest possible moment to lop off, until such time as a new generation, reared under new and free social conditions, will be able to throw on the scrap heap all the useless lumber of the state. End quote. Isn't this clear enough? The proletariat lops off, quote, the worst sides, end quote, of the democratic state. Parenthesis, for example, the police, permanent army, the bureaucracy as an independent entity, exaggerated centralization, etc., end parenthesis. But does not suppress the democratic state as such. On the contrary, it creates the democratic state in order to have it replace the, quote, military and bureaucratic state, end quote, which must be shattered. Quote, if there is anything about which there can be no doubt, it is that our party and the working class can only gain supremacy under a political regime like the Democratic Republic. The Democratic Republic is indeed the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as it has been demonstrated by the French Revolution. The Democratic Republic is indeed the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as has been demonstrated by the French Revolution, end quote. That is how Engels expresses himself in his critique of the draft of the Erfurt program. Engels does not speak there of a, quote, Soviet, end quote, republic. Parenthesis, the term was, of course, unknown, end parenthesis, nor of a commune republic, in contrast to the, quote, state, end quote. Neither does Engels speak of the, quote, trade union republic, end quote, imagined by Smith and Morrison and by the French syndicalists. Clearly and explicitly, Engels speaks of the democratic republic, that is, of a state democratized from top to bottom, quote, an evil inherited by the proletariat, end quote. This is stated so clearly, so explicitly, that when Lenin quotes these words, Lenin finds it necessary to obscure their meaning. Quote, Engels, Lenin says, quote, repeats here in a particularly emphatic form the fundamental idea, which, like a red thread, runs throughout all Marx's work, that the democratic republic comes nearest the dictatorship of the proletariat. For a democratic republic, without in the least setting aside the domination of capital, and therefore the oppression of the masses in the class struggle, inevitably leads to such an extension, intensification, and development of that struggle that, as soon as the chance arises for satisfying the fundamental interests of the oppressed masses, this chance is realized inevitably and solely in the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the guidance of these masses by the proletariat, end quote. Lenin, State and Revolution. However, Engels does not speak of a political form that, quote, comes nearest the dictatorship, end quote, as is interpreted by Lenin in Lenin's commentaries. Engels speaks of the only, quote, specific, end quote, political form in which the dictatorship can be realized. Engels speaks of the only, quote, specific, end quote, political form in which the dictatorship can be realized. According to Engels, the dictatorship is forged in the democratic republic. According to Engels, the dictatorship is forged in the democratic republic. Lenin, on the other hand, sees democracy merely as the means of sharpening the class struggle, thus confronting the proletariat with the problem of the dictatorship. For Lenin, the democratic republic finds its conclusion in the dictatorship of the proletariat, giving birth to the dictatorship of the proletariat, but destroying the democratic republic's self in the delivery. Engels, on the contrary, is of the opinion that when the proletariat has gained supremacy in the democratic republic, and thus realized its dictatorship, within the democratic republic, the proletariat will consolidate the latter by that very act and invest it with the first time with a character that is genuinely, fundamentally, and completely democratic. That is why in 1848 Engels and Marx identified the act of, quote, raising the proletariat to a ruling class, end quote, with, quote, the conquest of democracy, end quote. That is why in the Civil War Marx hailed in the experience of the Commune the total triumph of the principles of people's power, universal franchise, electiveness, and recall of all officials. That is why in 1891 in his preface to the Civil War, Engels wrote again, quote, against this transformation of the state and the organs of the state from the servants of society into masters of society, a process which had been inevitable in all previous states, the Commune made use of two infallible expedients. In the first place, the Commune confided all administrative, judicial, and educational functions to men chosen by universal suffrage, and it reserved to itself the right of recalling them at any time upon the decision of their electors. In the second place, all officials, high or low, were paid only by wages not surpassing the wages received by other categories of workers, end quote. Engels. Thus universal suffrage is, quote, an infallible expedient, end quote, against the transformation of the state, quote, from a servant of society into society's master, end quote. Thus only the state conquered by the proletariat, under the form of a basically democratic republic, can be a real, quote, servant of society, end quote. It is not plain that when he speaks this way and identifies at the same time such a democratic republic with the dictatorship of the proletariat, Engels is not employing the latter term to indicate a form of government. Engels is not employing the dictatorship of the latter term, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to indicate a form of government, but to designate the social structure of the state power. Let me repeat that whole sentence. Is it not plain that when Engels speaks this way and identifies at the same time such a democratic republic with the dictatorship of the proletariat, Engels is not employing the term dictatorship of the proletariat to indicate a form of government, but to designate the social structure of the state power. It was exactly this that is stressed by Kautsky in his Dictatorship of the Proletariat, when Kautsky says that for Marx such a dictatorship was not a question, quote, of a form of government but of its nature, end quote. An attempt at any other interpretation leads perforce to the appearance of a flagrant contradiction between Marx's affirmation that the Paris Commune was an incarnation of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the emphasis he laid on the total democracy established by the Paris Communards. Lenin's text demonstrates that when Lenin really permitted himself to make contact with the viewpoint of the creators of scientific socialism, Lenin rose above a simplest conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat and did not then reduce the conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat to dictatorial forms of organization of power, and did not then fasten to the term the meaning of a definite, quote, political structure, end quote. In the quotation from State and Revolution reproduced above, Lenin puts an equal sign between, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and, quote, the guidance of these masses by the proletariat, end quote. The equation corresponds entirely to the conception held by Marx and Engels. It is exactly this way that Marx represented the dictatorship of the proletariat under the Paris Commune when Marx wrote, quote, this was the first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, even by the great bulk of the Parisian middle class, the shopkeepers, tradesmen, merchants, the wealthy capitalists alone excepted, end quote. Marx. The voluntary acceptance by the great population of the hegemony of the working class engaged in the struggle against capitalism forms the essential basis of the, quote, political structure, end quote, that is called, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Similarly, the voluntary acceptance by the popular masses of the hegemony of the bourgeoisie permits us to designate the political structure existing in France, England, and the United States as the, quote, dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, end quote. This dictatorship is not done away with when the bourgeoisie finds it worthwhile to offer to the peasants and the petty bourgeoisie, whom the bourgeoisie directs, the appearance of sovereignty by granting them universal suffrage. Similarly, the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx and Engels had in mind can only be realized on the basis of the sovereignty of all the people, and, therefore, only on the basis of the widest possible application of universal suffrage. Footnote. In 1903, as is known, Plekhanov declared that when the revolutionary proletariat has realized its dictatorship, it may find it necessary to deprive the bourgeoisie of all political rights, including the right to vote, However, to Plekhanov, this is one of the possibilities, one of the contingencies of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In my pamphlet, The Struggle Against Martial Law Within the Social Democratic Labor Party of Russia, I tried to interpret Plekhanov's words as presenting an example admissible only in logical abstraction, and therefore used by Plekhanov to illustrate the thesis, quote, the safety of the revolution is the supreme law and takes precedence over any other consideration, end quote. I expressed the belief that Plekhanov himself probably did not presume that, after they had acquired power, the proletariat of countries that were, economically ripe for socialism could find themselves in a situation where it was not possible for them to support themselves in the willing acceptance of their direction by the people, but on the contrary had to deny to the bourgeois minority by force the exercise of political rights. Sorry, I want to repeat that sentence. I expressed the belief that Plekhanov himself probably did not presume that, after they had acquired power, the proletariat of countries that were economically ripe for socialism could find themselves in a situation where it was not possible for them to support themselves in the willing acceptance of their direction by the people, but, on the contrary, had to deny to the bourgeois minority, by force, the exercise of political rights. In a private conversation with me, Plekhanov objected to my putting such an interpretation on his words. I understood then that Plekhanov's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat was not free of a certain kinship with the Jacobin dictatorship by a revolutionary minority. I understood then that his conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat was not free of a certain kinship with the Jacobin dictatorship by a revolutionary minority. End footnote. Therefore, when we consider the opinions of Marx and Engels on the dictatorship of the proletariat, on the democratic republic, and on the, quote, state that is an evil, end quote, we are obliged to arrive at the following conclusion. To Marx and Engels, the problem of the taking of power, political power, by the proletariat is bound up with the destruction of the bureaucratic military machine which rules the bourgeois state in spite of the existence of democratic parliamentarism. To Marx and Engels, the problem of the dictatorship of the proletariat is bound to the establishment of a state based on sincere and total democracy, on universal suffrage, on the widest local self-administration, and has, as its corollary, the existence of the effective hegemony of the proletariat over the majority of the population. In that regard, Marx and Engels continue and extend the political tradition of the Mountain of 1793 and the Chartists of the O'Brien School. It is true, however, that it is possible to discover in the works of Marx and Engels the traces of other ideas. These appear to offer ground to theses according to which the forms, and even institutions that may embody the political power of the proletariat take on an essentially new character, opposed in principle to the forms and institutions that embody the political power of the bourgeoisie, and opposed in principle to the state as such. These ideas belong to a special cycle and merit a separate study. We shall deal with them in the following chapter. New section, the Commune of 1871. When he considered the Commune in his writings, Marx did not merely present his views on the dictatorship of the proletariat. The uprising had many enemies. The first thing to be done was to defend the Commune against the calumny of its enemies. It was natural for this circumstance to influence Marx's manner of dealing with the slogans and ideas of the movement that produced the events of March 1871. Because the revolutionary explosion which had led to the seizure of Paris by the armed people on the 18th of March 1871 was the expression of a fierce class struggle, it also provoked a conflict between the democratic Republican population of the large city and the conservative population of the provinces, especially that of the rural districts. During the preceding 2 decades, the, quote, backward, end quote, peasantry of France helped to crush revolutionary and Republican Paris by supporting the extreme bureaucratic centralism of the Second Empire. As a result of this, the revolt of the Parisian democracy against the national representatives visiting at Versailles appeared at first as a struggle for municipal autonomy. As a result of this, the revolt of the Parisian democracy against the national representatives sitting at Versailles appeared at first as a struggle for municipal autonomy. Footnote, quote, the 18th of March took the aspect of a rebellion of Paris against provincial oppression, end quote, writes Paul Louis, the historian of French socialism. Might be Paul Louis. End footnote. This circumstance gained for the Commune the sympathy of many bourgeois radicals, people who were for administrative decentralization and wide local autonomy. For some time, this aspect of the Paris Commune of 1871 hid the real nature and historic means of their movement, even from the most outstanding communards. In his book of recollections of the International, the anarchist Guillaume tells how immediately after the outbreak of the revolt, the Euro Federation sent their delegate Jacal to Paris in order to learn what would be the best way of helping the uprising, which the Eurasians considered to be the beginning of a universal social revolution. Sorry, I'm looking some of these people up. I don't think this is a particularly great translation. In terms of names, I've come across this a bunch of times where I go to look up a name that seems important, but James Guillaume, or Guillaume, was a leading member of the Euro Federation, the anarchist wing of the First International. Later, Guillaume would take an active role in the founding of the anarchist Saint Emier International.
James Guillaume. James Guillaume.
James Guillaume. Back to the text. In James Guillaume's book of Recollections of the International, the anarchist Guillaume tells how immediately after the outbreak of the revolt, the Euro Federation sent their delegate, Jacques, to Paris in order to learn what would be the best way to help the uprising, which the Eurasians considered to be the beginning of a universal social revolution. Great was the surprise of the men of Europe when their delegate returned with a report of the total lack of understanding shown by E. Varlin, the most influential of the, quote, left militants among the French internationalists. That's referring to a guy named, is it Eugène Varlin?
Eugène Varlin. Eugène Varlin.
Eugène
Varlin.
Eugène Varlin? I don't know. Great was the surprise of the men of Europe when their delegate returned with a report of the total lack of understanding shown by Eugène Varlin, the most influential of the, quote, left militants among the French internationalists. Eugène Varlin lived from 1839 to 1871 and was a French socialist, anarchist, communard, a member of the First International. Eugène Varlin was one of the pioneers of French syndicalism. Back to the text. According to Varlin, it appears the uprising had a purely local aim, the conquest of municipal liberties for Paris. According to Varlin, the conquest of these liberties was not expected to have any social and revolutionary repercussions in the rest of Europe. I don't know, it sounds like this guy's at least according to Wikipedia, it seems like this guy's a little more radical than this reading would suggest, but we shall continue. It is understood that this could have been said only during the first days of the Commune. Soon the historic scope of their revolution started to become visible to the Paris proletariat. Okay, well, actually, that qualifies my concern. It is nevertheless true that that eases my concern. It is nevertheless true that the Commune never completely freed itself from the bourgeois conceptions that wanted to limit its aim to the conquest of municipal autonomy. It is this lack of ideological clarity in the communards' minds that Marx later attacked in a letter to Kugelmann. In this letter, Marx mentions a demonstration against him by the communard refugees in London, and takes the occasion to recall that it was he, however, who had, quote, saved the honor, end quote, of the revolution of 1871. Marx, quote, saved the honor, end quote, of the Commune by revealing the Commune's historic meaning, a meaning that the communard combatants themselves were unaware of. But the Commune was influenced by other ideologies besides that of bourgeois radicalism. It also bore the imprint of anarchist prudentism, libertarian blanquism, the two tendencies that fused in the general French working class movement. The representatives of these currents of thought sought in the Paris Commune a content that was diametrically opposed to that which the democratic bourgeoisie wanted to put into it. The semblance of identity between the social revolutionary and the bourgeois radical viewpoints was only due to the fact that both took a common stand against the bureaucratic and centralizing leanings of the state apparatus left by the Second Empire. During the last few years before the Commune, the French Blanquists managed to make some contact with the working people of their country. The French Blanquists particularly passed beyond the bourgeois Jacobinism under whose influence, and the influence of the Babeuf school, and they grew up. While the Blanquists did not cease to draw their political inspiration from the heritage of the 18th century revolution, the most active representatives of Blanquism became more circumspect in regard to the Jacobin forms of democracy and revolutionary dictatorship. The Blanquists tried to find for the proletarian movement of their time an ideological support in the revolutionary tradition of the, quote, Hébertists, end quote, the extreme left of the sans-culottes of the French Revolution. In 1793-94, Hébert and his partisans found support among the real sans-culottes of the Parisian Faubourgs, whose vague social and revolutionary hopes they tried to interpret. By means of this support, the Héberists strove to turn the Paris Commune into an instrument by which they might exert pressure on the central government. Making use of the direct help of the armed populace, the Héberists wanted to transform the Paris Commune of 1794 into a center possessing total revolutionary power. As long as Robespierre had not as yet reduced it to the level of a subordinate administrative mechanism, and Robespierre did that by crushing the Héberists, and sending their chief to the guillotine, the Commune of 1794 really represented the active revolutionary elements among the Parisian sans-culottes by whom it had been chosen. Up to then, it incarnated the instinctive desire of the masses of the city poor to impose their dictatorship on the rural and provincial France with its backward political conceptions. Footnote: it is to Hébert's Commune of Paris and that of Lyon that belongs the credit of initiating the extreme acts of political terror, the September executions, the expulsion of the Girondins from the convention, and the measures of, quote, consumers' communism, end quote, by which the cities deprived of resources attempted to force the petty bourgeoisie of the villages and the outlying provinces to provide them with foodstuffs. It is in the communes of Paris and Lyon where the expeditions of the, quote, army of provisioning, end quote, started. There were organized the, quote, committees of poor, end quote, for the purpose of appropriating grain from the contemporary, quote, kulaks, end quote, whom the jargon of the period called, quote, aristocrats, end quote. The two communes of the French Revolution imposed contributions on the bourgeois and, quote, took charge, end quote, of the stocks of commodities produced by industry during the preceding years, especially at Lyon, From these organizations emanated the requisition of residences, the forcible attempts to lodge the poor in houses considered too large for their occupants, and other equalitarian measures. If in their quest for historic analogies Lenin, Trotsky, and Radek had shown a greater knowledge of the past, they would not have tried to tie the genealogy of the Soviets to the Commune of 1871, but to the Paris Commune of 1793-94, which was a center of revolutionary energy and power very similar to the institution of their own time. End footnote. The Commune, as the instrument of the revolutionary will and the direct revolutionary action of the propertyless masses, contrasted to the democratic state, became the political ideal of the young Blanquists during the latter years of the Second Empire. Footnote: in his letter to Marx on July 6, 1869, Engels mentions Tridon's pamphlet Les Héberistes in which the author presents the arguments of that wing of Blanchism. Quote, "It is ridiculous to suppose that the dictatorship of Paris over France, the rock on which the first revolution was wrecked, can simply be reproduced to meet with a different fate," end quote. Engels. End footnote. In the course of the revolution of March 18th, another political trend, that of the anarcho-Proudhonians, became visible. It moved alongside the, quote, Hebertian, end quote, current, at times mingling with it. Both tendencies saw in the, quote, commune, end quote, a lever of revolution. But to the Proudhonians, the commune did not appear to be a political and specifically revolutionary organization that, pitted against the just as political and more or less democratic state, was to obtain the effective submission of the latter by means of the dictatorship of Paris over France. They opposed every form of state as a, quote, artificial, end quote, that is, political grouping established on the basis of the subordination of the citizenry to an apparatus, even under the fallacious guise of popular representation. The, quote, commune, end quote, they had in mind was the, quote, natural, end quote, social organization of producers. According to their outlook, the commune was not merely to rise above the state, or subject the latter to its dictatorship. It was also to separate itself from the state and invite all 36,000 communes (cities and villages) of France to proceed the same way, thus decomposing the state and substituting for the state a free federation of communes. Quote, "What does Paris want?" end quote, asked La Commune on April 19th, and it answered its own question as follows, quote, "The extension of the absolute autonomy of the commune to all the localities of France, assuring to each its rights, to every Frenchman the complete exercise of his faculties and aptitudes as a human being, citizen, and worker. The autonomy of the commune will be limited to the right of equal autonomy of all the communes participating in the pact. Such an association will assure French unity," end quote. Logically flowing from this stand was a federalist program in the Proudhon-Bakuninist spirit, recognizing a voluntary and elastic pact as the only tie between the communes and excluding the complicated apparatus of a general state administration. The communards were quite pleased when they were nicknamed, quote, Federalists, end quote. Quote, "On the 18th of March," end quote, wrote the Bakuninist Arthur Arnauld. Let's see if anything comes up for that. Let's see. It appears that Arthur Arnauld refers to a guy who lived from 1833 to 1895. Arthur Arnauld was a French writer and journalist. Arthur Arnauld wrote under the pen name Arthur Mathy. He was a member of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor and the Theosophical Society. Arthur Arnauld married the widowed painter Delphine Decool in 1890. Arthur Arnauld is listed in the French Dictionary of Anarchists. Back to the text. Quote, "On the 18th of March," end quote, wrote the Bakuninist Arthur Arnauld, a member of the Commune. Quote, "The people declared that it was necessary to escape the vicious circle. that it was necessary to destroy the evil in the egg, that the thing to be done was not merely to change masters, but no longer to have any. In a miraculous recognition of the truth, seeking to reach the goal by all the roads leading to it, the people proclaimed the autonomy of the commune and a federation of communes. ... For the first time, we were to interpret the real rules, the just and normal laws which assure the true independence of the individual and the communal or corporative group, and to effect a bond between the various homogeneous groupings, so that they might enjoy, at the same time, union, in which there is strength, ... the autonomy, which is indispensable to ... the infinite development of the original capacities and qualities of production and progress. End quote. This communal federalism appeared to the anarcho-Proudhonians to be the organization in which the economic relation of the producers would find their direct expression. Quote, each autonomous grouping, end quote, continues Arnauld, quote, communal or corporative depending on circumstances, will have to solve within its own framework the social question, that is the problem of property, the relation between labor and capital, etc. End quote. Note the restriction, quote, communal or corporative depending on circumstances, end quote. The viewpoint of the Federalist Communard approaches quite closely to the outlook which in 1833 led Morrison and Smith to their formula of, quote, house of trades, end quote, which at the beginning of the 20th century gave rise to the doctrine of Georges Sorel, Edmund Burt, de Leon, and others on the replacement of the, quote, artificial, end quote, subdivisions existing in the modern state by a federation of, quote, natural, end quote, corporative, parenthesis, occupational, and parenthesis, cells, and which in 1917 to 1919 created the conception of the, quote, Soviet system, end quote. It looks like what is being referred to as Edouard Burt, who lived from 1875 to 1939. He was a theorist of French syndicalism and disciple of Georges Sorel. In 1911, he co-founded the Cercle Proudhon with Georges Valois. Burt tried to unify the materialism of Marx and the metaphysics of Bergson through his articulation of revolutionary self-organization of the proletariat. Quote, back to the text, quote, communal groupings, end quote, comments Arnauld later, quote, correspond to the ancient political organization. The corporative group corresponds to the social organization, end quote. Parenthesis, our emphasis, end parenthesis. Thus, the communal organization was to serve as a transition between the state and the, quote, corporative, end quote, federation. This opposition of a, quote, political, end quote, organization to a, quote, social, end quote, organization presumes that the, quote, destruction of the state machinery, end quote, by the proletariat will immediately reestablish among the producers, quote, natural, end quote, relations, which supposedly can only manifest themselves outside of political norms and institutions. This contrast underlay the social revolutionary tendencies that were in favor among the communards. Quote, everything that the socialists stand for, in which they will not be able to obtain from a strong and centralized power, no matter how democratic, without formidable convulsions, without a ruinous, painful, and cruel struggle, they will get in an orderly manner, with certainty, and without violence, through the simple development of the communal principle of free grouping and federation, end quote. Quote, the solution of these problems can belong only to the corporative and productive groupings united by federative ties and therefore free from governmental and administrative, in other words, political, parenthesis, our emphasis, end parenthesis, shackles, which will now have maintained by oppression the antagonism between capital and labor, subjecting labor to capital, end quote. That is how the most advanced of the communards, the combatants who were closest to the social revolutionary class movement of the French proletariat of the time, conceived the substance and scope of the Commune of 1871. Charles Segnobos is obviously wrong when he states, parenthesis, in his note on the Commune found in The History of the 20th Century by Levis and Rimbaud, in parenthesis, that the revolutionaries renounced their initial aim, the seizure of power in France, and rallied to the cause of the autonomous Commune of Paris because they found themselves isolated from the rest of France and had to pass to the defensive. The latter circumstance merely helped the triumph of the anarcho-federalist ideas in the development of the Commune. If in the program of the Communards, the Hébertist conception of the Commune as the dictator of France ceded ground to the Proudhonian idea of an apolitical federation, it is because the class character of the struggle between Paris and Versailles came out in the open. At that time, the class consciousness of the proletarians in the small industries of Paris gravitated entirely around the ideological opposition of a, quote, natural, end quote, union of producers within society to the, quote, artificial, end quote, unification of the producers within the state. We have seen how, at the beginning, Varlin presented the Commune as a thing of pure democratic radicalism. In its proclamation of March 23, 1871, the Paris section of the International declared that, quote, the independence of the Commune is the guarantee of a contract whose freely debated clauses will do away with the class antagonism and assure social equality, end quote. This means the following. After the state and the power of constraint exercised by the state had collapsed, it becomes possible to create a simple, quote, natural, end quote, social bond among the members of society, a bond based on their economic interdependence, and is precisely the Commune that is destined to become the framework within the limits of which this bond can be realized. Quote, we have demanded the emancipation of the workers, end quote, continues the proclamation, quote, and the communal delegation is the guarantee of this emancipation, for it will provide every citizen with the means of defending his rights, of controlling effectively the acts of the mandatories charged with the administration of his interests, and of determining the progressive application of social reforms, end quote. It is easily seen that, for the anarchist idea of a commune of labor, that is, a union of producers, as contrasted to a union of citizens within the state, the proclamation discreetly substitutes the idea of a political commune, the prototype of the modern state, a state microcosm, inside of which the representation of interests and the satisfaction of social needs become specialized functions, just as, parenthesis, though certainly in a more rudimentary form, in parenthesis, in the complicated mechanism of the modern state. P. Lavrov understood this quite well. He had thus notes in his book on the Commune, quote, in the course of the 19th century, the unity of communal interest disappeared entirely before the increased struggle of classes. As a moral entity, the Commune did not exist at all, parenthesis, emphasis by Lavrov, end parenthesis. In each commune, parenthesis, municipality, end parenthesis, the irreducible camps of the proletariat and the big bourgeoisie faced each other, and the struggle was further complicated by the presence of many groups of the small bourgeoisie. For a moment, Paris was united by a common emotion, irritation with the Bordeaux and Versailles assemblies, but a passing emotion cannot be the basis of a political regime, end quote. He adds, quote, the effective autonomous basis of the regime to which the social revolution will lead is not at all the political commune, which admits equality, the promiscuity of the parasites and laborers, etc. It is formed rather by a conjointly responsible group of workers of every kind rallied to the program of the social revolution. End quote. P. Lavrov speaks clearly of a, quote, confusion of two notions. One, the autonomous political commune (municipality), the ideal of the Middle Ages and the struggle for which the bourgeoisie solidified itself and grew strong during the last stages of its history, and 2. The autonomous commune of the proletariat, which is to appear after the economic victory of the proletariat over its enemies, after the establishment within the community of a social solidarity that is inconceivable as long as the economic exploitation of labor by capital continues, and, therefore, as long as class hatred within each community is inevitable. When we analyze the demands of communal autonomy, as they were generally formulated in the course of the struggle in question, we may ask what relation could the unquestioned socialists of the Paris Commune see between the fundamental problem of socialism, the struggle of labor against capital, and the slogan of the, quote, free commune, end quote, which they inscribed on their flag, end quote. The paradox indicated by Lavrov consists of the following, quote, not a quote, the very possibility is this a quote? I don't think this is a quote. The very possibility of the process of transforming the capitalist order into a socialist order is subordinated to the existence of a social form whose mold, we believe, can only be furnished by a more or less developed socialist economy. This confusion is typical of the anarchists. If it is obvious that the destruction of the basis of private economy, the transformation of the whole natural economy into socialist economy, will do away with the need of having an organization rise above the producer in the shape of the state, the anarchists deduce from this that, quote, the destruction of the state's, quote, decomposition, end quote, into cells, into, quote, communes, end quote, is a prerequisite condition for the social transformation itself. There existed in the ideology of the communards a juxtaposition of Proudhonian, Iberist, and bourgeois autonomous notions, so that in their discussions they pass with the greatest of ease from the political, quote, commune, end quote, a territorial unit created by the preceding evolution of bourgeois society, to the, quote, corporative, end quote, commune, the free association of workers, EU, which we may imagine will be the social grouping when a socialist order has been achieved and the collective effort of one or two generations will have rendered possible, quote, the progressive atrophy of the state, end quote, as predicted by Engels. An interesting exposition made by Dunoyer, one of the witnesses who appeared before the inquest commission appointed by the Versailles National Assembly after the fall of the Commune, suggests the following conclusion. The, quote, communalist, end quote, ideas, as they were conceived in the minds of the workers, merely represented an attempt to transplant into the structure of society the forms of their own combat organization. Quote, in 1871, the group of the workers within the International, the grouping of the workers within the International by sections and federations of sections was one of the elements that contributed towards the spread of the commune idea in France, end quote. The International, quote, possessed a ready-made organization where the word, quote, commune, end quote, stood for the word, quote, section, end quote, and the Federation of Communes was nothing else than the Federation of Sections, end quote. Compare this statement with the citations that we made in the preceding chapter from the writings of the English trade unionists of 1830, whose programs called for the replacement of the parliamentary bourgeois state with a, quote, Federation of Trades, end quote. Let us recall the analogous thesis of the French syndicalists in the 20th century. And let us not forget that in our time working people take to the, quote, idea of the Soviets, end quote, after knowing them as combat organizations formed in the process of the class struggle at a sharp revolutionary stage. In all the, quote, commune, end quote, theses, we discover one recurring point. It consists in spurning the, quote, state, end quote, as the instrument of the revolutionary transformation of society in the direction of socialism. On the other hand, Marxism, as it developed since 1848, is characterized especially by the following. In accordance with the tradition of Babeuf and Blanqui, Marxism recognizes the state naturally after its conquest by the proletariat, as the principal lever of this transformation. That is why already in the 1860s, the anarchists and Proudhonians denounced Marx and Engels as, quote, statists, end quote. I got to go back. There's a footnote I missed. We find today, 1918 to 1919, end among the Bolsheviks in Russia and in Western Europe the same confusion, with their specific, quote, political form, end quote, that is supposed to accomplish the social emancipation of the proletariat. Also for these people, the question is said to be one of replacing the territorial organization of the state with unions of producers. Indeed, at first, that was described to be the essence of the Republic of Soviets. This substitution is presented to us at the same time. 1. As the natural result of the functioning of an achieved socialist regime, and 2. As the prerequisite condition necessary for the realization of the social revolution itself. The confusion overflows all boundaries when an attempt is made to remedy it by resorting to the new notion of a, quote, Soviet state, end quote. The latter is supposed to incarnate the organized violence of the proletariat, and in that capacity prepare the ground for the, quote, withering away, end quote, of all forms of the state. But at the same time, it is in principle supposed to be opposed to the state as such. The Paris Communards reasoned the same way. They permitted themselves to imagine that the commune state of 1871 was something whose very principle is the opposite of any form of the state, while in reality it represented a simplified modern democratic state functioning in the manner of the Swiss canton. End footnote. What then was the attitude taken by Marx and Engels toward the experience provided by the Paris Commune when the proletariat tried for the first time to realize a socialist, quote, dictatorship, end quote? New section, Marx and the Commune. The Proudhonists and the anarchists were not greatly addicted to the study of economics. They had a naive, almost simplistic conception of what would follow the seizure of the means of production by the working class. They did not realize that capitalism has created, for the concentration of the means of production and distribution, so huge an apparatus that in order to lay hold of these means, the working class would require effective administrative machinery extending over the entire economic domain that was previously ruled by capital. They had no idea of the immenseness and complexity of the transformation that would come as a result of a social revolution. And only because they did not understand all these things was it possible for them to think of the autonomous, quote, commune, end quote, itself based on, quote, autonomous, end quote, productive units as the lever of such a transformation. Marx was well aware of the preponderant role played by anarcho-Proudhonism in the movement that brought forth the Paris Commune. In a letter to Engels, June 30th, 1866, he referred ironically to, quote, Proudhonian Stirnerianism, end quote, which is inclined to, quote, decompose everything into small groups or communes that are expected to come together again in some kind of union, but of course not in the state, end quote. In 1871, however, Marx faced the task of defending the Paris Commune against its enemies who were drowning it in blood. He faced the task of justifying, in the shape of the Commune, the first attempt of the proletariat to seize power. If the Paris Commune had not been crushed by exterior forces, this effort would have led the workers beyond its first aim and shattered the narrow ideological bounds that repressed its vigor and denatured its content. We can therefore understand why, in his apology of the Commune, Marx could not even pose the question whether the realization of socialism is conceivable within the framework of autonomous city and rural communes. In face of the existing division of labor, economic centralization, and the degree of development of the powerful means of production already attained at that time, merely to pose the question would have been tantamount to a categoric rejection of the claim that the autonomous commune could, quote, solve the social question, end quote. We can understand why Marx avoided the question whether a federalist union of communes could assure systematic social production on the scale customary to the preceding capitalism. We can understand why Marx touches only lightly on one of the most serious problems of the social revolution, the relationship between the city and the country. It merely declares without any supporting evidence that, quote, the communal constitution, organization, would bring the rural producers under the intellectual lead of the central towns of their districts, and they're secure to them in the working man the natural defenders of their interests, end quote. But would it be possible to hold the socialist economy in the framework of a federation of autonomous communes, while this federation permitted the economic direction of the country by the city? Marx could not permit himself to, quote, adjourn, end quote, all these questions. He could assume that such problems would automatically find their solution in the process of the social revolution, and would, at the same time, just cast out the anarcho-communalist illusions that prevailed in the minds of the workers at the beginning. But Marx did not merely remain silent on such contradictions of the Paris Commune. It is undeniable that Marx attempted to solve them by recognizing the Commune as, quote, the finally discovered political form permitting the economic emancipation of labor, end quote, and thus contradicted his own principle that the lever of the social revolution can only be the conquest of state power. Quote, the communal constitution, end quote, declared Marx, quote, would have restored to the social body the forces hitherto absorbed by the parasite feeding upon and clogging the free movement of society, end quote. Marx, Civil War in France. Quote, the very existence of the commune as a matter of course led to local municipal liberty, but no longer as a counterweight against the power of the state, which thenceforth became useless. The very existence of the commune as a matter of course led to local municipal liberty, but no longer as a counterweight against the power of the state, which thenceforward became useless, end quote. Thus the, quote, destruction of the bureaucratic and military machine of the state dealt with in Marx's letter to Kugelmann changed imperceptibly and came to stand for the suppression of all state power, of any apparatus of compulsion in the service of the social administration. The destruction of the, quote, power of the modern state, end quote, the continental type of state, became the destruction of the state as such. Are we in the presence of an intentional lack of precision, enabling Marx to gloss over in silence the weak points of the Paris Commune at a moment when the Commune was being trampled by triumphant reaction? Or did the mighty surge of the revolutionary proletariat of Paris, set in motion under the flag of the Commune, render acceptable to Marx certain ideas of Proudhonian origin? No matter what is the case, it is true that Bakunin and his friends concluded that in Marx's Civil War in France, Marx approved of the social revolutionary path traced by them, so that in his memoirs, Jean Guillaume observes with satisfaction that in its appreciation of the Commune, the General Council of the International, under whose auspices the Civil War in France was published, adopted in full the viewpoint of the Federalists. And Bakunin announced triumphantly, quote, the communist revolution had so mighty an effect that despite their logic and real inclinations, the Marxists, with all their ideas overthrown by the Commune, were obliged to bow before the insurrection and appropriate its aims and program, end quote. Such statements are not free from exaggeration, but they contain a grain of truth. It is these not very precise opinions of Marx on the destruction of the state by a proletarian insurrection and the creation of the Commune that Lenin recognizes as the basis of the new social revolutionary doctrine Lenin presumes to reveal. On the top of these opinions of Marx, Lenin raises the anarcho-syndicalist canvas, picturing the destruction of the state as the immediate result of the conquest of the dictatorship by the proletariat, and replacing the state with that, quote, finally discovered political form, end quote, which in 1871 was embodied in the Commune and is represented today by the, quote, Soviets, end quote. Since, quote, the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, in different surroundings and under different circumstances, have been continuing the work of the Commune and have been confirming Marx's analysis of history, end quote. Already in 1899, in his well-known Principles of Socialism, Edward Bernstein observed that in the Civil War, Marx appeared to have taken a step toward Proudhon. Quote, in spite of all points of difference that existed between Marx and the, quote, petty bourgeois, unquote, Proudhon, it is nevertheless true that on this question their currents of thought resemble each other as closely as possible, end quote. Bernstein. Bernstein's words throw Lenin into a great fit of anger. Quote, monstrous, ridiculous, renegade, end quote, screams Lenin at Bernstein, and he takes the opportunity to revile Plekhanov and Kautsky for not correcting, quote, this provision of Marx by Bernstein, end quote, in their polemics against Bernstein's book. Footnote. Of course, Lenin too wrote a great deal on the subject of Edward Bernstein's book without taking the trouble of correcting that quote, perversion, end quote. End footnote. But Lenin could have attacked on the same count the quote, Spartacist, end quote, Franz Mehring, unquestionably the best student and commentator of Marx. In his Karl Marx, The History of His Life, published in Leipzig, 1918, Mehring declares explicitly, leaving no room for doubt, quote, as ingenious as were some of Marx's arguments, on the Commune, they were to a certain extent in contradiction with the conceptions championed by Marx and Engels for a quarter of a century and previously formulated by them in the Communist Manifesto. According to these conceptions, the decomposition of the political organization referred to as the, quote, state, end quote, inevitably belongs among the final accomplishments of the coming proletarian revolution. It will be a progressive decomposition. That organization has always had as its principal purpose to assure, with the aid of the armed forces, the economic oppression of the working majority by a privileged minority. The disappearance of the privileged minority will do away with the need of the armed force of oppression, that is, state power. But at the same time, Marx and Engels emphasized that in order to achieve this, as well as other, even more important results, the working class will first have to possess itself of the organized political power of the state and use it for the purpose of crushing the resistance of the capitalists and recreating society on a new basis. It is difficult to reconcile the General Council's lavish praise of the Paris Commune for having commenced by destroying the parasitic state with the conceptions presented in the Communist Manifesto, end quote. Franz Mehring. I should probably actually repeat that last sentence since it's in italics. It is difficult to reconcile the General Council's lavish praise of the Paris Commune for having commenced by destroying the parasitic state with the conceptions presented in the Communist Manifesto, end quote. Mehring. And Mehring adds, quote, one can easily guess that Bakunin's disciples have utilized the address of the General Council in their own fashion, end quote. Mehring is of the opinion that Marx and Engels clearly saw the contradiction existing between the theses presented in the Civil War and their previous way of posing the problem as a question of the conquest of state power. Mehring writes, quote, thus when, after Marx's death, Engels had the occasion to combat the anarchist tendencies, he, for his part at least, repudiated these reservations and resumed integrally the old conceptions found in the manifesto, end quote. What are the, quote, old conceptions found in the manifesto, end quote? They are the following. 1. The working class seizes the state machinery forged by the bourgeoisie. 2. The working class democratizes this machinery from top to bottom. See the immediate measures which, according to the manifesto, the proletariat of that time would have had to enact when it seized power, It thus transforms the machinery formerly used by the minority for the oppression of the majority into a machine of constraint exercised by the majority over the minority, with a view of freeing the majority from the yoke of social inequality. That means, as Marx wrote in 1852, not merely, quote, to seize the available ready machinery of the state, end quote, of the bureaucratic police and military type, but to shatter that machine in order to construct a new machine on the basis of the self-administration of the people guided by the proletariat. Lenin put to use the inexact formulae found in civil war in France. These formulae were sufficiently motivated by the immediate need of the General Council to defend the Commune, directed by the Hébertists and the Proudhonists, against its enemies, but they did away almost completely with the margin existing between the thesis of the, quote, conquest of political power, end quote, presented by the Marxists, and the idea of the, quote, destruction of the state, end quote, held by the anarchists. On the eve of the Revolution of October 1917, in his struggle against the Republican democratism practiced by the socialist parties which he opposed, Lenin used these formulae with such good effect that he accumulated in his State and Revolution as many contradictions as were found in the heads of all the members of the Commune: Jacobins, Blanquists, Hébertists, Proudhonians, and anarchists. Objectively, this was necessary, Lenin himself did not realize it without doubt, so that an attempt to create a state machine very similar in its structure to the former military and bureaucratic type, and controlled by a few adherents, might be presented to the masses, then in a condition of revolutionary animation, as the destruction of the old state machinery, as the rise of a society based on a minimum of repression and discipline, as the birth of a stateless society. At the moment when the revolutionary masses expressed their emancipation from the centuries-old yoke of the old state by forming, quote, autonomous republics of Kronstadt, end quote, and trying anarchist experiments such as, quote, workers' control, end quote, etc., at that moment the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and the poorest peasants, end quote, said to be incarnated in the real dictatorship of the supposed, quote, true, end quote, interpreters of the proletariat and the poorest peasants, the chosen of Bolshevist communism, could only consolidate itself by first dressing itself in such anarchist and anti-state ideology. The formula of, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, was found to be the most appropriate to express mystically a tendency that agitated the revolutionary elements of the population at that time. This slogan presented to the revolutionary elements of the population two contradictory aims. One, the creation of a machine that would crush the exploiting classes in the benefit of the exploited, but two, which would at the same time free the exploited from any state machinery presupposing the need of subordinating their wills as individuals or groups to the will of the social entity. No different in origin and significance is the, quote, Soviet mysticism, end quote, now current in Western Europe, 1919, end parenthesis. In Russia itself, the evolution of the, quote, Soviet state, end quote, has already created a new and very complicated state machine based on the, quote, administration of persons, end quote, against the, quote, administration of things, end quote, based on the opposition of, quote, administration to, quote, self-administration, and the functionary, official, to the citizens. These antagonisms are in no way different from the antagonisms that characterize the capitalist class state. There's a footnote here that I missed, and it says, let us recall that Lenin said that if 200,000 proprietors could administer an immense territory in their own interest, 200,000 Bolsheviks would do the same thing in the interest of the workers and peasants. End footnote. The economic retrogression that appeared during the World War has simplified economic life in all countries. One of the results of this simplification is the eclipse in the consciousness of the masses of the problem of the organization of production by the problem of distribution and consumption. This phenomenon encourages in the working class the rebirth of illusions that make it believe in the possibility of laying hold of the national economy by handing over the means of production directly, with the aid of the state, to single groups of workers, quote, workers' control, end quote, quote, direct socialization, end quote, etc., in parentheses. From the ground provided by such economic illusions, we see rise again the fallacy that the liberty of the working class can be accomplished by the destruction of the state, and not by the conquest of the state. This belief throws back the revolutionary working class movement toward the confusion, indefiniteness, and low ideological level that characterized it at the time of the Commune of 1871. On one hand, such illusions are manipulated by certain extremist minorities of the socialist proletariat. On the other hand, these groups are themselves the slaves of these illusions. It is under the influence of this double factor that these minorities act when they seek to find a practical medium by which they might elude the difficulties connected with the realization of a real class dictatorship. Difficulties that have increased since the class in question has lost its unity. Footnote, quote, unity in what, end quote, one may ask. Certainly not unity on the basis of socialist understanding, on the basis of a wide movement for the abolition of the existing system, exclamation point. What was never lost nationally or internationally because it has yet to become a fact, paraphrasing Marx, parenthesis, his letter to Bolta, 23rd of November 1871, it can be said that if, quote, revolutionary minorities, end quote, cast their nets with a measure of success and some historic justification, it but indicates that the working class is not yet ripened for an independent historic movement. The, quote, revolutionary minorities, end quote, will find their fishing mighty poor when the working class reaches that maturity. That footnote was from Indiger, the translator. Back to the text. Fundamentally, this anarchist illusion of the destruction of the state power, fundamentally, this anarchist illusion of the destruction of the state covers up the tendency to concentrate all the state power of constraint in the hands of a minority, which believes neither in the objective logic of the revolution nor in the class consciousness of the proletarian majority, and with still greater reason that of the national majority. The idea that the, quote, Soviet system, end quote, is equal to a definite break with all the former bourgeois forms of revolution, therefore serves as a screen behind which, imposed by exterior factors and the inner conformation of the proletariat, there are again set in motion methods that have featured the bourgeois revolutions. I'm going to repeat those last couple of sentences because they were all in italics. Fundamentally, this anarchist illusion of the destruction of the state power covers up the tendency to concentrate all the state power of constraint in the hands of a minority, which believes neither in the objective logic of the revolution, nor in the class consciousness of the proletarian majority, and with still greater reason, that of the national majority. The idea that the, quote, Soviet system, end quote, is equal to a definitive break with all the former bourgeois forms of revolution, therefore serves as, quote, a screen behind which, serves as a screen behind which, imposed by exterior factors and the inner conformation of the proletariat, there are again set in motion methods that have featured the bourgeois revolutions. And those revolutions have always been accomplished by transferring the power of a, quote, conscious minority supporting itself on an unconscious majority, end quote, to another minority finding itself in an identical situation. The end. Thank you so much for listening.